story of the Most of the Future Partnership is a huge success story. People working together to overcome one of the biggest landscape restoration challenges anywhere in Europe. This is the result of fantastic enthusiasm from a raft of organisations working together. We're still at the start of the story. Restoration needs to continue, and it will play a vital part in fighting climate change into the future. The partnership started way back in 2002 because we had an environmental catastrophe taking place here, horizon to horizon areas of the most degraded upland peatland anywhere in Europe. Carrying out research and taking actions that are based on evidence is key to everything that we do.
So our objective today is to go and collect some samples and see whether the work that we've been doing is having a tangible impact on the landscape up there, which has an impact down here in the valleys. We've arrived on the Kinder Plateau, and right now we're arriving at the bare peat control site. So this line here is where the revegetation work 11 years ago stopped, and this is what there was before the revegetation work. So just a large area of bare peat which covered a lot of the South Pennines. Bare peat is a big problem for various reasons. One of them is climate change. So peat is about 50% carbon, and where it's loose and unprotected like this, it gets released from the surface into the atmosphere, contributing to climate change. So we're just arriving at our first monitoring site here. This is where all of the water flows out of the bare peat area. And so here we measure two things. We can measure water quality by taking a water sample, and from that we can see how much peat is washing out as sediment into the streams, and we can also measure how much water is flowing out, and then we'll head over to the areas where we've done restoration work. We can compare the data from those two sites, and the comparison of those two sites shows us the impacts of the restoration work.
We have been working in partnership since 2003. This has been a massive team effort from a huge range of organisations. When we're tackling a challenge on this scale, partners and volunteers are a crucial part of data collection across this vast landscape.
Right, today we're going out to do vegetation monitoring and to check vegetation since we did the original restoration.
It's essential we gather the data so that we know what is growing or not growing, when and where.
Ellie, would you like to come into this side of the quadrant and work out from each of your perspectives what the cover is?
The unimaginable scale of past atmospheric pollution has left this landscape cut and scarred and left black and eroded. It is entirely possible that this landscape can actually be returned into really good condition. We are just passing some of our contractors who are at the early stage of our restoration process, spreading brash.
Which are basically these heather cuttings. So the heather's been cut from another site where there's plenty of heather, and it's put into bags, and we fly them up onto the hill using a helicopter.
The surface of the peat is very delicate, and we have to be really careful not to disturb it. The machines we use are adapted to prevent damage, and we have to be really careful with how, where and how much we use them. Many of the sites are inaccessible by vehicle, so the only way we can deliver materials is by helicopter.
Once all the heather brash is spread, again with the helicopter we spread seed and some lime and fertiliser onto the bare peat and the heather brash.
Without our intervention, this peat would not regenerate naturally. It is far too damaged.
Now these gullies shouldn't even be here, and they've been created by the wind and the rain eroding away and cutting through the peat into our water supply. So we block these channels with a range of materials. They might be stone, timber or peat. The idea of blocking the channels is to slow the flow of the water off the hill, create wetter conditions around the moor and stop the sediment being washed off into the water supply.
The last step, which is essential to recreate a properly functioning bog, is to plant sphagnum moss. We plant tiny plug plants by hand. It is labour intensive, but we found this is the best way of doing it. The plugs spread, and our aim is to form an understory of the moss across the moors like existed before these places were damaged. Peatlands are as important as woodlands in the fight against climate change and biodiversity loss, and we're sharing that message.
Blanket bogs are really unique habitats that support rare wading birds that nest on these blanket bogs over the summer months. The curlew, the dunlin, the golden plover, and it's their chicks that will feed on the invertebrates that are living within the vegetation. It's a really crucial habitat as well for raptors, such as merlin, peregrine, short-eared owl, as well as being a crucial habitat for other species such as the adder, the common lizard and the mountain hare. The Bogtastic van travels all around the South Pennines Special Area Conservation. We're raising awareness about why blanket bogs are so important and why they are such fantastic habitats and why everyone should care for them, from people in the countryside, on the doorstep, all the way through to people in the heart of the cities.
Our vision for where we'd like to get the Dark Peak and the South Pennines is into more condition like this. So the blanket bog landscape from here all the way up to the Scots border, it is here because of this little plant. So all of the carbon that this bit of the plant here has locked up in building its plant structures end up eventually as peat. That's why it's so important as in taking carbon out of the atmosphere. But the benefits go beyond climate change. The effects of a damaged moor can be catastrophic.
Because we've got bare peat here, it's essentially a flat, smooth surface. So when the rain, when it lands on it, just washes straight into the streams. So there's nothing to hold it back. So once it's in the streams, it's getting down into the valleys. And because that happens really quickly, we get a big surge of water in storm events, which can make flooding events quite severe in the valleys and then in the communities and towns further downstream.
The flooding events of 2015 and 2020 caused complete devastation for the village of Headland Ridge.
Serious rain. That's insane.
The actual landscape completely transformed into one of devastation, with people being rescued from their cars. I think for me that experience really highlighted, one, the resilience of people and our need to build that resilience into our landscapes. Human activity has definitely shaped the South Pennine Park, and in particular the Industrial Revolution. Here behind you can see the mills. The Industrial Revolution very much caused the degradation of our landscape, especially the vegetation on the tops.
The Peak District sat there, the Industrial Revolution started, Manchester, Sheffield, each side, pumping out sulphur dioxide, acid rain, kills pretty well all the living layer of sphagnum. When there isn't a layer of vegetation there, the rain comes down and you've got bare peat and it just washes straight off. So the initial work that's being done is just to get something there to stop this erosion.
In storm events, heavy rain can wash the peat off the surface, gets into the streams as little particles. So those particles are just suspended in the water. And this is a problem for water chemistry. So where we've got peat in the water, that's the water that we drink, comes out the tap in our houses. And before we can drink it, it has to be cleaned. All that peat has to be taken out, which is expensive and time consuming for the water companies.
So we're here at Severn Trent's water treatment works at Bamford, where we're treating the water that's come off the upland catchments behind us into Lady Bower Reservoir. And this is where we're removing the sediment that's washed off of those catchments. And it's really important that we remove all of that sediment so that we're supplying clean, wholesome drinking water to our customers. So we invest in the catchment management because the removal processes for taking all of that sediment and peat out of the water is really energy intensive. And so it's really cost beneficial for us to invest in re-wetting and restoring the moorlands so that it's not getting into the water in the first place.
We're just arriving at our revegetated site here. If you can imagine it, 11 years ago, this was completely bare peat, the same as the control site we were at just before. So there was no vegetation here at all. The partnership planted everything that's here now. So all of this vegetation has come back following that work. And we have also put in these gully blocks. And you can see the combination here of this moss, which is getting really nice and wet, and these gully blocks. Everything's being slowed down as it moves through. But I mean, here it looks great. We can see that there's loads of vegetation. We can see the gully blocks. But we don't really know the impact that's having until we get down to our monitoring site and get some numbers out and see what's actually happening. This is the monitoring station where we are measuring the effects of restoration. And I'm going to take all of the same measurements here as I did at the bare peat control site. So if we compare these two tubes, this one's from the bare peat site, this one here is from the restoration site. You can see there's loads of peat washing around in this one, and there's nothing in this one at all. And that sort of backs up the data that we've been collecting over the last 11 years. That essentially, almost as soon as we've done the revegetation work, the peat stops eroding off the slopes. So we now have a 99% reduction in the amount of peat that's washing off this site as compared to the bare peat control site. And what we're finding is that as the sphagnum grows and thickens, it slows down the water as it flows across the catchment and through the streams. And that has a significant effect on flood severity further down the river system. But what we're finding is that over the years, these benefits are continuing to improve, and that's because the sphagnum is continuing to grow. This is a small area. We've done loads of work here, and we can see the effects at this scale, on a small scale. And if you think we've done that work all over the South Pennines, and when you multiply that up to the landscape, it has a really significant effect in terms of climate change, water quality, and flood severity.
So this whole area is the control plots. So unlike the other areas which have been treated, this is to show us what it would have been like had we done nothing.
More barren it is.
Oh yeah.
It's so much less alive.
Yes.
The evidence that we see in front of us now is that you can take a really degraded, ruined blanket bog landscape, dead bogs basically, and you can bring them back to life.
That's why we carry on doing the restoration work that we're doing, because we know that it's working. You know, turning a negative story, which these malts were, into a positive story, which they are becoming.
So after 20 years of this work, it is entirely possible that this landscape can actually be returned into really good condition.
A lot of the way it is has been shaped by humans, but by the same token that humans have degraded it and impacted it, we've also got this huge capacity for restoring it, and that's happening here. And you really see that when you look at this bare square and then the square that's really full of life.
Both the visual and the scientific difference that we've made to this landscape over the last 2 decades is quite startling. We need to roll out this success. As a partnership, we now need to increase everyone's awareness, inspire people, continue to gather scientific evidence. We've got to keep the pressure on. We've got to deliver a landscape in the next few years, resilient to climate change for the benefit of people, the planet and wildlife into the future.